When a father left his 3-year-old daughter in the Alabama dirt, he didn't look back. He couldn't. Because looking back meant staying, and staying meant dying. It was the last days of summer in 1950, and in those cotton fields outside Selma, the sounds rising in the darkness weren't just crickets. They were lynch threats, the cold breath of Jim Crow, and the reality that a black man's chances of survival were shrinking by the day. Samuel Washington boarded a train at midnight. One-way ticket. Detroit. As he left 3-year-old Ruth in her grandmother's arms, he said, "I'll come back for you. When I'm ready, I'll come back for you." But when that moment finally came, Ruth would be 25 years old. 22 years would pass. And the distance between father and daughter would become something far deeper than geography. This story is just one drop in the Great Migration, when 6 million black Americans fled the South between 1916 and 1970. But every drop represents a family torn apart. Every train ticket carries a child's sense of abandonment. Every goodbye risks becoming forever. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and continue discovering the untold stories of this forgotten exodus. Share it so the forgotten can be remembered. Samuel Washington arrived in Detroit in the first week of September 1950. When he stepped off that Greyhound bus, he had $23 in his pocket, one shirt on his back, and a promise in his heart to bring his daughter home. Detroit in those days was the promised land for black migrants. Ford, Chrysler, General Motors. The factories ran day and night, and they hired every hand, regardless of color. But what Samuel didn't know was this: Detroit had racism too. It was just quieter, more insidious, more institutional. In the South, you lived under the threat of lynching. In the North, you faced rental signs that read, "No colored tenants." There were jobs, yes. But there was no justice. No equality. Just a system of oppression that was less visible than the South's. Samuel settled in Detroit's Black Bottom neighborhood. He lived in a cramped, damp room shared with 6 other men. He woke at 6 in the morning and worked the assembly line at Packard Motor Company until 6 at night. 60 hours a week. After his shift, his hands trembled and his back ached, but every time he cashed that paycheck, he thought of Ruth. A little more. Just a little more, and I'll bring her here. We'll find a safe place. I'll send her to school. But Detroit was expensive. Rent, food, coal, transportation. Everything cost multiples of what it had in the South. And Samuel's wages were enough to survive on, but not enough to build a life for 2. The first year, he sent letters every month. To her grandmother, not to Ruth, because Ruth couldn't read yet. The letters said, "I'll come soon. Work is going well. When I save a bit more, I'll bring you all here." But in the second year, the letters became sparse. By the third year, they stopped completely. Because one day, leaving the factory, Samuel broke his arm. He couldn't work for 3 months. No work meant no pay. For 3 months, he ate through everything he'd saved. And at the end of those 3 months, he was back at zero. The plan to bring Ruth home was postponed. Then postponed again. Then it began to fade. In Alabama, Ruth was growing up. Her grandmother raised her with love, but every night, she looked out the window and said, "Your daddy's coming. Your daddy didn't forget you." Ruth kept looking out that window at 4, 5, 6 years old. By 7, she stopped looking. At 8, she asked, "Is my daddy dead?" Her grandmother said, "No, he's just far away." But Ruth was starting to understand that distance could feel like death. At 9, she realized she couldn't remember her father's face. By 10, she stopped trying. By 1960, Ruth was 13, and Selma, Alabama was deep in the darkest days of Jim Crow. Separate seating on buses, back doors at restaurants, whites-only water fountains. School segregation. Job segregation. Life segregation. Every day, Ruth walked miles to the black children's school because she wasn't allowed on the white children's bus. Every day, she passed the edges of the white world but was never part of it. And every night, her grandmother still said, "Your daddy's in Detroit. Your daddy didn't forget you." But Ruth didn't believe it anymore. Because 10 years had passed. 10 years without a letter, a phone call, or any word. Her father had become just a story. A story told but never touched. In Detroit, Samuel had turned 40. He still worked at the factory, but now he worked like a machine. No soul. No light in his eyes. Every evening when he came home, he took a sip of cheap whiskey and remembered Ruth. But remembering hurt. Because remembering meant acknowledging failure. For 10 years, he'd said soon. But soon never came. Now Ruth was 13, and Samuel wouldn't recognize her. Maybe Ruth wouldn't recognize him either. Maybe it was better this way. Maybe some promises weren't meant to be kept. Maybe some children were meant to grow up without fathers. Samuel lived with these thoughts. And every day, he sank a little deeper. When 1965 came, Ruth was 18 and determined to leave those Selma cotton fields behind. Her grandmother had grown old and couldn't work anymore. Ruth cleaned houses for 12 hours a day and washed dishes at a local diner at night. But the money wasn't enough. It never was. One night, her grandmother gave her an envelope. Old, yellowed, corners worn. Inside was the last letter Samuel Washington had sent in 1951. And beneath the letter, an address, 3427, Hastings Street, Detroit, Michigan. Go, her grandmother said. Find your father. Maybe he's been looking for you too. Ruth took the envelope and stared at it for a long time. An address written 15 years ago. Maybe Samuel didn't live there anymore. Maybe he'd moved to another city. Maybe he was dead. But Ruth knew that if she didn't go, she'd never know. And not knowing was the worst answer. In November 1965, Ruth boarded a Greyhound bus. One-way ticket. Detroit. Same route, same city, same hope. But this time, it wasn't a father leaving. It was a daughter returning. During the 18-hour journey, Ruth never slept. She looked out the window, and with every city line they crossed, she felt herself moving farther away. From Alabama. From the past. From abandonment. When she arrived in Detroit, the cold November morning hit her face. She had one suitcase, $30 in her pocket, and a 22-year-old question in her heart. Why did you leave me? Detroit in 1965 was at the peak of the Great Migration. 500,000 Black Americans lived in this city. Factories, jazz clubs, churches, neighborhoods. A black middle class was beginning to form. But so were ghettos. Poverty, unemployment, drugs, crime. Detroit had two faces. One was hope. The other was disappointment. Ruth took a cab to Hastings Street. The driver, a white man, looked in the mirror and said, "That's not a good neighborhood." Ruth said nothing. She just looked out the window. 3427, Hastings Street was an old apartment building. Peeling paint, creaking stairs, mildew stains on the walls. Ruth climbed to the 4th floor and stood in front of apartment 4B. She waited for a long time. She couldn't bring herself to knock. Because what would happen when the door opened? What if Samuel wasn't there? What if he didn't recognize her? What if he didn't want her? Ruth took a breath and knocked. The door opened. Standing before her was a man with tired eyes, graying hair, and a bent back. In his 50s. His hands trembled, and his breath smelled of whiskey. Samuel Washington. Ruth recognized him. She didn't remember his face, but she remembered his eyes. Those were the eyes she'd seen in a photograph 15 years ago. But now those eyes held no hope. Only exhaustion. "Yes," the man said. Ruth couldn't speak. Her throat was tight. Then she said one word. "Daddy." Samuel Washington froze. His eyes widened. His mouth opened, but no sound came. Long seconds passed. Then he stepped back. "No," he said. "No, no, no." He tried to close the door, but Ruth put her hand against it. "I'm Ruth," she said. "Your daughter." Samuel began trembling in the doorway. His eyes filled. His knees buckled. And there, in that old apartment hallway, a 50-year-old man collapsed to the floor and began to cry. 22 years of held tears came flooding out. Ruth knelt beside her father. She didn't embrace him. She just sat there, silent. I didn't forget you, Samuel said, his voice breaking. Not one day. But I couldn't. I couldn't bring you. I had nothing. I still have nothing. Ruth looked at her father. There was neither anger nor mercy in her eyes. Just a question. Why didn't you ever write? Samuel couldn't answer. Because the answer was shamefully simple. He didn't write because he couldn't. Every letter reminded him of his failure. Every line repeated the promise he couldn't keep. And over time, not writing became easier. Forgetting became easier. Or so he thought. I don't know, he finally said. I don't know. Ruth stood up. She picked up her suitcase and started to turn. Samuel called after her. Where are you going? Ruth stopped. She didn't turn around. She just said this, I didn't come here to forgive you. I came to understand you. And now I do. Then she walked. Down the hallway, down the stairs, onto the street. Detroit's cold November wind hit her face. She didn't cry. Because there were no tears left. For 22 years, she'd imagined a father. Strong, protective, loving. But the reality was disappointment. The reality was a tired man. A man consumed by factory work, lost in Detroit streets, drowning in his own failure. But the story didn't end there. 3 days later, Ruth was staying in a cheap boarding house when someone knocked on her door. She opened it to find Samuel standing there. He held 2 sandwiches and a coffee. His eyes were clear, his hair was combed, and he wore a clean shirt. Would you like some food? He said. Ruth didn't close the door. But she didn't open it either. She just looked. I wasn't a good father, Samuel said. But maybe I can try now. I know it's late. Too late. But maybe even too late is worth trying. Ruth was silent for a long time. Then she opened the door. She took the sandwich. They sat together. They didn't talk. They just ate. And this was the beginning. They'd lost 22 years. For 22 years, a father and daughter had lived apart. But in that small Detroit room on that cold November day, something changed. Forgiveness didn't come. Because forgiveness takes time. But something began. Maybe healing. Maybe just acceptance. Maybe just 2 broken people feeling a little less broken in each other's presence. Samuel showed Ruth around Detroit. The factories, the river, the jazz clubs. Ruth told Samuel about Alabama. The cotton fields, her grandmother, a child growing up alone. And over time, 22 years of silence began to fill with words. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. Some days, Ruth was angry. Some days, Samuel shut down. But each day, they moved a little closer. In the spring of 1966, Ruth decided to stay in Detroit. She found a job, rented a small apartment. Samuel visited her once a week. They ate together. They talked. And one day, Ruth told him, I haven't forgiven you. But I'm not angry anymore either. Samuel nodded. That's enough, he said. That's more than I deserve. The Great Migration is the story of 6 million people. But every story is a wound. Every migration is a loss. Samuel Washington and Ruth are just 2 names. But those 2 names carry the truth that millions of families lived. Fathers had to leave their children. Because Jim Crow laws forced them to. Mothers left aging parents behind. Because life in the North was expensive. Siblings lost each other. Because migration wasn't a family reunion. It was a survival strategy. And some families never reunited. Some children never saw their fathers. Some letters were never written. Some promises were never kept. But Ruth and Samuel found each other. Late, broken, incomplete, but they found each other. And maybe that was a victory. In 1972, Ruth got married. Samuel came to the wedding. He stood beside the groom's father and watched his daughter through tears. After the ceremony, Ruth approached him and said, "Thank you." "For what?" Samuel asked. "For not giving up." Samuel looked at his daughter. His eyes filled, but he smiled. "You didn't give up," he said. "You found me." And maybe that was the deepest truth of the Great Migration. What was lost was sometimes found. What was broken was sometimes mended. What was abandoned sometimes came back. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. And life, even imperfect, was worth living.